So I'm just doing a quick overview. I know everybody heard about this, and we talked a little bit about it yesterday morning. It feels like longer ago than that, doesn't it? But it was just yesterday morning we talked about that. So just kind of a review of the big picture, what we're doing here as the Alliance. The National Teacher Education Standards Project over the last 10 years has kind of now got us to phase 4, where we're developing this idea of, and that was the original title of phase 4, develop a teaching certificate program. What we're talking about is certification by portfolio review right now. This is one little slice of that phase 4, but that's where we're at in this giant project, right? And you saw this beautiful little picture that Virginia provided for us. So we're at phase 4. We're in the let's develop this now. We're ready to jump off the cliff, so to speak, right? So a whole bunch of stuff is part of phase 4. We have a credential now, right? Certified Educator of Therapeutic Massage and Body Work. And we're at the certification process, which we're going to talk about today. And actually I'll skip that because I'm going to talk more in detail. Other things involved in phase 4, just so you know, a certificate program or several certificate programs have yet to be determined. We have a core curriculum, or a model curriculum, I think it's called, where now certificate programs around teacher training can be developed. But that's all, so this is all kind of part of phase 4 that's yet to be kind of fleshed out. So just so you know, we're talking about certification as part of this. It's not all of phase 4. Does that make sense? Okay. And then as part of certification, there will be a renewal process. What's been talked about so far is every 3 years, and that your continuing education will be in the areas of teaching and learning, right? Not different than your continuing education for your licensure, for whatever your particular practice is, things like that. Okay, so just that kind of, here's where we are, so let's funnel down. And these are just the bullet points. Remember yesterday, Ruth read this really beautiful value proposition of why you might want to be a certified educator. And those bullet points are just like, and I will share these slides, by the way, afterwards, so you don't need to write any of this stuff down, is if that looks familiar to you, do you think these represent you, then you might want to consider becoming certified to kind of say, see, I do fit this picture. But deciding to become certified actually requires a process of kind of evaluating yourself, right? That's what the portfolio process is all about. Putting together a portfolio is an educational process, right? I'm preaching to the choir right now because I love this because you're all educators, you know. But so you can go through these, but these are just teased out of that value proposition you already have access to, okay? So you put together a portfolio, and you might be thinking, who's going to look at this portfolio? Who's going to be evaluating me? And that makes me a little nervous sometimes. But so the really cool thing about this, so this is my opinion and perspective, but the really cool thing about this is the portfolios are reviewed by your peers. They've been trained in how to review a portfolio, first of all, and how to use the software we use and everything like that. But it's people who know what it takes to stand up here and talk in front of people and go through all the process of trying to understand the learning process, trying to apply some of the things, because how many people started out teaching in massage because you were just happened to be a content expert and somebody asked you to step into the classroom, you're good at, and then, so how many people, keep those hands up, how many of you were actually trained educators at any point before that? One. We've got one. Thank you for sharing. And now I'll hand the mic to you. No, I'm like many of you, I was trained in science and then massage, and somebody said, come teach anatomy and physiology, because you kind of have a background in this stuff, and I had no idea how to do that. I was accidentally kind of good at it, and really a lot of ways not. But how do we know that, you know? So this putting together a portfolio process is really important because you get to kind of see where are those areas I can work on for myself, because we didn't have that. A lot of us didn't have that background, right? And the good news is the reviewers have kind of been trained at how to look over the portfolio, look for evidence that you meet the core competencies. Who have read the core competencies? Not everybody's raising their hand, but yeah, it's a challenge to read through those, huh? It's a really important learning process. There's some language in there that educators use in a bunch of different fields, not just massage. This is really detailed stuff, right? So it's really important learning process just to read through those core competencies. And that's what the reviewers are doing. They're looking for evidence in your portfolio that you meet these 10 core competencies. And there's a specific rubric that you may have downloaded from our website that they use to check your competencies based on the evidence you submit. All right? Huh? Grade you? I hate using that terminology. Assess. Ooh, we'll talk about assessment in a minute. Okay. Any questions? Hi.
Stop.
We need you to be on the microphone.
Mr. Microphone. I just wrote something down, and I thought it would be an opportune time to say that we've used the word deficiency here, and something's lacking in your portfolio. Sometimes the problem won't be that you're lacking something and you have to go find training. Sometimes it might be in the way that you've presented the material. And so my hope is, as we're going through this today, you'll start to think you're going to have to dig deep into your background to say if something comes back to you, it might be, oh, right, I did this and here's the evidence. So some of this is going to be back and forthing, which happened in the beta test as well. But don't get nervous that a deficiency is a really permanent deficiency. It just might be somewhere digging something out of your psyche.
Yes, thank you for making that point, and we will make that several times today. Because part of the review process is very often, well, we don't find evidence of this particular competency. Doesn't necessarily mean you don't meet it. It's just that we couldn't find evidence in your portfolio, and it's an opportunity to then present more evidence. Excellent, thank you for pointing that out. So I thought, not everybody raised their hand, but just as a quick reminder of the core competencies, there's 10 standards. And they're kind of divided into 4 areas you may have noticed: the learner and learning, the content category, instructional practice, and then professional responsibility. So as we're thinking through putting together certain elements of the portfolio, we're thinking, how do we meet competency 1? Okay, well, what would be evidence of that? And so we're making sure that that exists somewhere in your portfolio. So just keeping those things side by side as you're thinking through. Am I going too fast? Everybody's good so far? All right. Did anybody take a look at the rubric that's used? There's a page for each standard and a little description of what it means to meet the expectations of this particular standard and what it might mean if you don't meet those expectations. And the reviewers actually will check off where they found evidence of that particular standard. So that's the little check boxes and stuff on the rubric. So, we ought to use a rubric. We're educators and we're reviewing educators. Did you want to say anything about that? I did print off a few copies of the rubric so we could have it at each table. I assumed we might have 3 tables, but we have a little bit more. But I think I have.
Thanks. I'm curious about the reviewers. If I submit a portfolio, is one reviewer going to review me, or are all reviewers going to review me?
Well, 2 will be assigned right away. The process as it stands right now, and we're developing this, is 2 reviewers will take a look independently at the portfolio, look for evidence, and be able to discuss whether or not their findings match. And if we need a third reviewer to kind of come in and break any kind of tie or anything like that, we have the opportunity to do that. And we may bring in a fourth. So it starts with 2 reviewers and goes from there based on those 2 findings. That's as muddy as it gets right now, but that's where we're at. Yeah.
Can you talk about the decision to go to a binary decision?
If you will talk about that, that'd be great. So Ruth's going to share a little bit about why we went with that 2 people first.
Actually,
approach.
I was thinking about something a little bit different. So in the beta test, you'll see it has on your charts, it has does not meet expectations, meets expectations. It's a yes or no. It's an up or down vote.
These 2.
In the beta test, we had a third category, which was exceeds expectations. And the consensus after that was that's such a subjective point of view, and it seems pejorative almost to say meets expectations but doesn't exceed them. And we decided ultimately our job, or the job of the process, is to determine who meets the standard and who doesn't meet the standard. And so having this third option was not necessary and really potentially problematic. So that's one of the ways that the beta test has changed the final product.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. So in your teaching, as you're putting together your teaching portfolio, which is your body of evidence of how you meet these competencies, there are things you may already have that you can just throw in your portfolio. Maybe you need to explain them a little bit. And there are things that you may need to prepare, and there are things you might need to get from others. So my suggestion would be start with the things you need to get from others, because when something you need for your portfolio is out of your control, it may take a little longer, right? So one of the items in your portfolio is getting letters of recommendation from 2 people, and you shouldn't pick randomly. You should actually pick people who know something about how you teach. That makes sense, right? So maybe a supervisor, an administrator, another colleague who's observed your teaching and can comment specifically on how you might meet these standards. So it might also be helpful to hand them the standards to which they might be writing a letter for you. That's a good question.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I'll walk around with that.
I was just asking about the letters of recommendation and if they can be from maybe a past graduate, because like in our community college, my boss will observe my teaching, and outside of her, it's my students. So I could have one person that's a professional, but others, could it be a past graduate?
I'm going to let Virginia take that.
So I'll answer this from an academic perspective and say if you were applying for a job at another institution of higher education, generally speaking, the letters need to come from above or appear slightly above. So while a letter from a student, former student, might be supportive, it would not hold the same kind of weight. But along those lines, in looking at the components on the rubric in the different categories, if you don't want to pile the standards onto somebody and say, especially if they're not in your discipline, right? If they're not massage therapists, what you can do to help them is give them points of things that you feel would be important for them to consider when they observed your teaching, like, recall that in my evaluations, I was really committed to learner development, and I did this in the classroom, and I did that in the classroom. So you're not writing a letter for them, but you're guiding them, and that will help them write a letter that speaks to you. That also might explain how the letter in your portfolio will be used to check off boxes on different standards. So it's a triangulation method, so that would probably hold more weight.
Repeat that question.
Let her be.
What about a CE provider like myself who doesn't really?
Yeah, we don't have superiors.
Right, and so
Colleagues, isn't that what that means? I'm teaching the other therapists.
So if you're teaching to a colleague who is another therapist who is a CE provider, I mean, basically looking at a peer. Who's your peer versus who's a former student? If a student took your class and they liked it, having them write a letter would not hold as much weight as a peer who took your class who also is a CE provider. Right? And so again, you're going to have to dig a little deep, but what's really interesting is this encouraging us to form connections with each other rather than build our empires. So it might be somebody who attended one of your conference presentations, let's say. So they attended a conference presentation, yay, and can we talk about my teaching, and can you write something about me and my quality of my teaching? So there's not, with all of this, there's no hard and fast answer, right? So that's what's
right. And in our midst, we have someone who's gone through this process. We have a couple someones who've gone through this process. So Deb would like to share what she did.
Yeah, what I did is because, I'm from a rural area where there's not a lot of CE providers, what I did was choose students that went through my program, meaning that they had an experience of what I did, but I also chose them because they had advanced degrees. They both had master's degrees and know about research and know about how, educational that educational background to lend that credibility to that is what I chose for them.
The nice thing about a program of this size is it allows us a certain amount of flexibility.
Yeah.
I have a question as to whether or not the letter of recommendation can be from one individual for several. So I'm thinking in my organization specifically, Kathy is our education specialist who has the master's in education, and she is also responsible for evaluating all of our adjunct faculty. So she would be the one writing a lot of letters of recommendation, and is that going to be a flag?
I will give you a funny answer you'll appreciate. If she writes a letter for each individual, that's terrific. Speaks to their strengths and follows your institutional format. If it's one letter and everybody is good at the same thing, and I've seen this on grant applications, then that probably would raise a flag. But yes, in bigger schools, they're likely to see this. And also remember, it's not just one person reviewing things. So if they saw this and it's like, oh, look at this, the faculty from HAC are all applying, it would be your responsibility to write the letters. And by the way, if it's your responsibility to write the letters, please don't say no if people ask you, and it probably will happen. So please don't say no. Please take the time, and again, let them help you. But yeah, not the same letter. The template letter is a little creepy.
And it wouldn't be, knowing her. Any other questions related to, these are good, and these are things we have to think through, so that's why we wanted to do it together. All right, so that's something you need to, ask for help outside of yourself and your realm. So things you may already have. We'll just start, yeah, go ahead. Okay.
Test. Yes.
So I'm assuming that the application process is blinded. So are the letters of recommendation blinded as well? Or would that be something that would give away who it is that you're...
So no, okay, so it's not blinded, and the reason why it can't be is part of the portfolio process is a video.
Oh, right.
Yeah, so, and
So no... I know that
lady.
So the letter, we know who the letters are from, we know who's applying.
Got it.
What we have asked of the reviewers is to recuse themselves if they feel like they're not an appropriate reviewer for this particular application. And we have to start somewhere, and that's where we've decided to start, yeah. Yep, excellent. Another one, okay. That's why we're here.
So to elaborate, so Kathy would be writing the evaluations on our adjunct faculty members, 10 of them, including myself. However, I'm the administrator, so how does that work? I then write one on her? Because I'm...
So the answer is yes, people close to you who can speak for you. So if, God forbid, Kathy decided to get a job at a different massage school, right? Generally speaking, she would not ask you for a letter of recommendation because she would be leaving you. This is different. And so if the two of you got together and wrote all of the letters for your faculty and they spoke to your faculty, in everything else in the faculty members' materials, that would appear supportive, or not, but we hope supportive. And you writing them for each other, also, it doesn't hurt the process at all. Remember, we're moving everybody forward, and the goal of this is to represent you to the best of your ability to accurately speak of what you have. But again, really good questions. I think some of you are going to have the reverse problem, which is the I'm in the middle of nowhere, how do I get somebody? And start to think about using these conferences as chances to connect with people, to share what you know in places where you do share, and that will help build all of our connections collectively.
Good. Yeah, good question. All right. So things you already have, and all of these will come as a caveat for CE providers, because you may not call them these things, and it just depends on your situation. But how many people have a syllabus for their course, or a course outline? Maybe you call it that rather than. So you've already got some place to start. Right, so in your portfolio, you're putting together a portfolio about yourself and how you meet core competencies, but you're kind of picking, maybe you teach a number of things, but you kind of want to pick something. My recommendation would be to pick something you're the most expert at to submit for your courses. But it just might be what you need to, the course you're submitting or the course you're using to illustrate your competencies is something you feel passionate about, but that most helps you demonstrate the evidence that you meet those things. So if you call it a syllabus, if you call it a course outline, what type of information is in that? What type of information do we have in our syllabi or our course outlines?
Meeting dates, times, locations, learning goals and objectives.
Core competencies.
Competencies? Anybody else?
Core outcomes.
Outcomes, so intended outcomes. For,
Grade scales and policies.
So out of all of that, because for some of you at your institutions, course outline and syllabus are different, right?
Yeah.
And so the syllabus has the summary, learning objectives, grading scale, so on and so forth. The course outline has the list of topics and the dates. Okay? How many of you think you would rather submit the course outline for this? Raise your hand. How many of you would like to submit the syllabus for this portfolio review? Raise your hand.
and
how many of you would submit both?
Yeah.
It really is both, and the
Yeah.
both. So if you don't separate them, it's not a big deal. If you do separate them, you want to submit both to give the reviewers this. The analogy you want to have in your head is if I gave you a test on curriculum and a course in curriculum and instruction, and at the end of my course that I taught you, I said I want you to write a syllabus and a course outline and hand it in for your final assignment. That's what you want to show here. Does that make sense? A couple of nods. We got it. Good.
Yeah. And keep going. Well, which of those or both are showing evidence that you meet some of these course development category of the core competencies. So, yep. We're looking for how are we demonstrating evidence.
I have a couple questions. I don't know about other institutions, but where I teach, I'm also a continuing ed provider. My curriculum is given to me. So that's not really a good representation of me, although I do it well. The second question is, do you have a thought about, and maybe I'm answering my own question, a curriculum from my school or my continuing ed syllabus and outline?
This is an excellent, I'm glad you asked that question because we need to talk about this. So yeah. You're human, but you are using someone's property to teach with, right? So what are some thoughts about this, first of all? Yeah. Because we have a lot of instructors that are teaching from prescribed curriculum.
So sadly, I've served on course and curriculum committees at universities, so there's a lot of these go through processes for approval. That's not the only thing you're submitting. This shows what your content is. You're representing, this is something that I teach. And so if you, for example, gave a syllabus and a course outline for art history, it wouldn't make it. But if it was a syllabus and a course outline for kinesiology, now we're connected. So there's that component of saying, here's something that I teach. So then if you have your kinesiology syllabus and your course outline and it's handed to you by the school, that's, okay, that's fine. But later on, how you personally assess in the classroom and exercises that you do, that's part of your statement, that's part of your letter, that's the triangulation component there. So you don't need to submit both, but for some of you, you might need to submit 2 syllabi and course outlines if you feel it's not enough in your portfolio. That option is probably open. Does that help?
That option definitely is open, and that's the point. You're submitting so that we know what course you're teaching, so that as we are reviewing this with all the other evidence you're presenting, that, okay, you submitted a syllabus and course outline for kinesiology, and then, because one of the competencies, I think standard 4 is content knowledge. So in some of the other evidence, you're going to demonstrate your knowledge in this syllabus, course outline that you've submitted, because even if you didn't write that, you are having to teach it. So yeah. I don't know where the microphone is. Okay.
So a question just for clarification. The certification is going to be to the individual. It doesn't matter if that individual does multiple things, i.e. teach in a classroom setting and be a continuing education provider. That we're not delineating what role you're playing as an educator. It's
That's
just
correct.
you as the educator are certified. I just
That's
wanted
correct.
to clarify that.
And it's not-
Segueing on that, as somebody who went through the beta test process, I did ask myself, okay, I'm a classroom educator in entry-level school. I'm also a CE provider. Which one do I want to do? So what I had to do, and you're going to make your own decision, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but my perspective was I went through the whole rubric that they were going to grade me with and realized I actually have more evidences and more assessments from my classroom than I do from my CE class, because as a CE provider, do I give pop quizzes? No. Do I even give grades? No. So as it ends up, I ended up being a CE provider because they asked me to. But if it were a choice, I think I would have picked classroom just because I felt like I had that material that was a little more solidly along the lines of what they were looking for in the rubric.
Yeah, thank you. Did you want to add to that?
So I was just going to say, actually, it would get very suspicious if HAC submitted applications for 10 teachers, and it was the exact same syllabus for every teacher and the exact same template. And again, this is a cartoon kind of thing, but some people are not really going to be thinking about this. So it doesn't have to be different for everybody, but you're going to have people teaching multiple courses. But it's just building to that portfolio, thinking maybe for you all about promotion, tenure kind of things.
Well, from my perspective as a CE provider who went through the beta test as well, is that the question that I had that came up is you didn't really specify what you meant by course outline or syllabus, because, in the academic world, there's a whole definition of what that means versus a continuing education provider. There's a sense of what that means and what does it really mean. So, it made me do a lot of investigation in terms of, okay, well, what really should I include as part of the course outline, because there wasn't any direction on that. So it gave me a deeper dive into what I was doing to make sure that I was complying with what I thought you guys wanted. Whether or not that was a healthy exercise to do or not, I don't know, but it was helpful for me to see, well, how does academia view this versus, say, what the NCB is asking as part of their thing for a course outline. So that's how I approach the issue.
You tell me when to stop.
I'll move on in a second, but this is good. This is good discussion.
You're getting your steps in.
I really appreciate the fact that you chose the classroom with the higher criteria, because I've always understood from the beginning of this that it's not a representation of what you know, but how you present it, the value of your being in the classroom. And for my criteria, I mean, I've heard horror stories for 15 years. Ruth, cover your ears. I've taken classes by people who wrote the book. And because they wrote the book, you assume they're going to be expert. They're up in front of the room and they're dead as fish, you know?
Everybody says that about me.
No, never. That's why I said cover your ears.
Yeah, we're
Cover your ears.
sorry, Ruth.
But if I'm looking at investing my time and money with continuing ed providers, I ask everybody, who did you like? You know, and if I know that you've gone through this criteria, I mean, I'm looking at it individually as a classroom presenter. But as a consumer, if I see continuing ed providers and I have a choice of taking myofascial with this person or that person, I'm going to look for the one with the certification.
That's good feedback.
It's definitely good feedback.
So are you going to be penalized if you don't actually have pop quizzes or even
We're
give
gonna
a
get
grade for the class?
We're going to get to assessments.
Okay.
That actually is one of the probably the biggest things we'll focus on.
Can I jump in and say something? One thing is that many of us have probably taken a CE class where you walk in and there's no agenda, it just starts. And so if you're a CE provider, and even if you've gotten your NCB approval, but you're not following your course outline, this reminds, especially in the CE community, that we need to have an outline and an agenda, we need to have learning objectives, but we also need to have, we're going to come up with the F and the S words, formative and summative assessments. If you're not giving quizzes, what is it that you're doing? But I just have a question in general, because we're on syllabus right now. Can everybody who's here right now think of a representative syllabus that you could, and or course outline that you could submit as part of your portfolio? And if you can think of that, I encourage you to grab one of these Hilton pads and just write that down, so that just right now, stream of consciousness, I got this is what I'm going to submit, because then we can move on to the thornier parts that are to come.
Yeah. This isn't.
It's not the thorny part, I'm sorry.
This is the relatively easy part.
This is the part we're comfortable with?
Let's talk about lesson plans then, for example. How many people have lesson plans right now they could submit, that they think they could submit? People who work in schools have their hands up. Pete, sit down.
No jumping.
Right, the CE table, one or two people raise their hands. But yeah, so what is a lesson plan? What is a lesson plan? A lot of times we have these words that have been defined quite extensively in the education realm, and if we haven't any experience there, we might not know that we have this information. We might just not be calling it a lesson plan. If you work in a school, hopefully you've written your lesson plans, or someone has written them for you, and you're teaching from those, right? So what's in a lesson plan? Just a couple.
What you're doing and when you're doing it.
What you're doing and when you're doing it, that's pretty simple. Did you want to add to that, Deanna?
Oh, just how you teach to your objectives.
So how you plan to meet your objectives. It's your plan. Right? Anybody else?
Activities you might do with the students.
So activities, so that's part of the how you're doing it, right?
Yep.
This is what I plan to do in these 15 minutes. Here's what I plan to do over the next hour.
Assessment and answers.
Assessment and answers.
Practicum and feedback.
Certainly for hands-on, you're doing that.
Practicum and feedback.
Anybody else want to add? Okay.
We also include the resources needed in the classroom and the classroom setup.
Yeah. What are you using to do that? Props. I call them props, but yeah.
So in my classes, I've made up games, lots and lots of games as a way to get the students engaged. And they've got my own titles on them. Would a lesson plan also say, and if you had to pick up this lesson plan and teach it, this is how this game works? Because it wouldn't be obvious to anyone but
so
me.
So if I was going to submit my lesson plans for review, and I said, Deanna's tic-tac-toe, I would probably want to describe what that is for everyone else but me. Right, so a lesson plan really should be that extensive, in my opinion, but did you want
But
to?
not if you're going to pick this up and do it, because we're used to this handoff thing. So maybe in your statement that you submit with your whole application, if you're, if Deanna's tic-tac-toe is one of your hands-down greatest things, you might say, one of the ways I engage students in my classroom is to play this particular game. You don't have to list rationale for every activity that you play, but in other words, probably doctoring the lesson plan is not a good idea, but providing supplementary explanation. So if I said, for example, we're going to play tennis in the classroom, it will not involve a racket and a ball, it'll involve a memorization exercise. So somewhere in there I need to explain what that is.
And that's a good point. Let me just expand on that for a second. So part of the application process is through this online portal where you're going to upload these files one at a time. Here's where the syllabus goes. Here's where the lesson plan goes. And you might not want to, in fact, just submit the lesson plan how it is written, but it's quite okay and highly recommended to maybe have an explanation with each of these things, like she just described, and this is how I use this and this. And I would, if I were submitting my portfolio, probably go so far as to say, this is how I feel I'm meeting standards 5 and 6. Because I do this and this in the classroom, as you can see on lesson plan 1, page 4. Something like that, as an example.
So question, can you just verify for me, so I have a course in kinesiology. Do you want a lesson plan for each class, or do you want sample of one class?
It says 2 lesson plans.
You're going to submit 2 lesson plans. So your course may be
15 classes.
15 weeks. A lesson plan, so just to understand, your lesson plan is for each section or each day. So you're going to, let's say you have a lesson plan for each day. You would submit 2 days worth of lesson plans as an example for that course.
If you teach more
Let's
than...
your CE provider, and we'll talk about that in a second.
If you teach more than one class, can you submit a lesson plan from each class? Would that count as 2, or do they need to be from the same class?
I would say there should be no requirement to have it be from the same class, because we're not assessing your course content. The assessment is, and I'm not an assessor, but assessing what you do. So for example, if you teach pathophysiology and a lot of your teaching is blah, 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 but it covers a lot of content related to massage, that might be your syllabus. For learner engagement, and for formative and summative assessments, if you submitted your kinesiology class, the lesson plans for kinesiology, I think what Deanna was asking for is some context for what you're seeing in your portfolio. So again, you've got the statement that's kind of the cover sheet that says, I submitted this as evidence of blah, 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 and here's why. I submitted this as evidence of such and such. And what I would say is I'd kind of backpedal and say, we really don't want you to doctor these to make them pretty for us. We really want it to show what it is. So again, as you're going through this process and you pull together your lesson plans, most of you are prepping for fall. If you're going through this process right before you're doing your fall courses and your lesson plans, you see an opportunity to do something that's in the competencies, then by all means, that could be done now and move you forward. Does that help?
Supplement.
Sorry, they're having a conversation over here. I'm
I
talking
apologize.
too much. No, I'm talking too much. It's okay.
Okay, so there is no requirement that it needs to come from the same course, if that's clear.
If you teach more of a lecture class, like a science class, and you teach more of a technique or a massage type class, you might want to submit 2. Same thing with the videos. Like
and I wouldn't disagree with that. I think that'd be a great source of evidence.
The goal with these submissions is to cover as many of the competencies as you can.
Yeah. So if you're a CE provider, then let's just address this in a little in a little big way. You don't have a 15-week class, most likely. Maybe you have a 1 or 2 day class, even. 4 hours. Try that one. A 4-hour. Okay. Are you going to cover one subject in that 4 hours? Does that subject have subcategories? Here's why I'm asking. whether it's counted as one lesson plan or 2 lesson plans, there are sections to those 4 hours that you could potentially have written a written plan to cover. So if I don't know, let's make something up.
I'll be happy to offer a
Use one of
pathology.
your examples.
So probably, you know, an example of a class I might submit a lesson plan for, as a course might be a class I teach called, it just flew out of my head. Yeah, no, I'm choosing one. Fibromyalgia and the Invisible Diseases. Okay, and in that 4-hour unit, I talk about fibro and chronic fatigue and irritable bowel and pelvic pain syndrome. So the course is fibro and the invisible diseases. The lessons are, here's the fibro section, here's the chronic fatigue section, and within those, there are breakdowns for the topics under those that come under those headings. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So it's about outlining. If you can write an outline, you can do this.
So I was just going to ask, can we go back to that pretty graph for a second? The pretty chart.
Of
Yes,
that one.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. I just wanted to come back to this for a moment because we did this when we were on the phone together. We just kept going, come back to this for just a second here. We want to look at this. So far we've covered syllabus and course outline, and we've also covered lesson plans. In your syllabus and your lesson plans, can you see how somewhere in those documents there would be a way that you can show evidence that you address learner development and well-being? Right? So learner development and well-being, some of that might be in how you have in your syllabus that you give feedback to students. Some of you might have that in your lesson plans of how you do formative assessments in your one lesson to make sure that learning happened. Learning differences and integrative approaches, that might be in recognizing students who need to be referred to disability services. So it seems kind of mundane to look at that, but you're essentially taking apart those documents. Where's your content knowledge? And so if you get handed a syllabus and you get handed lesson plans, the content knowledge, some of that's going to probably come in your statement of this is what I bring to all this, and this is why I'm teaching here, and here's how I teach it. And then planning for instruction. So planning for instruction is the lesson plan, but is there anything else that you do that want to give that context to say, you know, having the students be centered before class or little things that you want to add to that? Does that help to see how the pieces fit together a little bit? Kind of a few nods, a few furrowed brows. So you're not telling us, here's how I teach kinesiology. You're telling us, here's how I teach.
That's really important. That's the whole reason we're doing this, right? Yeah. Excellent.
Ooh, or here's a good example. Observation and assessment. In your lesson plan, I've taken this class, in your lesson plan, the teacher said, here's the disorder we're going to cover today in our clinic class, and here's the protocol we're going to follow. Okay, match up a partner and go have at it. And we'll take a break in 45 minutes. That was the lesson plan. So if that's your lesson plan, it probably needs a little help. And how do you engage the students through that process in the clinical class so that you're observing and you're assessing them and you're reassessing and you're reinforcing? Good. That scared some people. I'm sorry. Don't do that.
There's no scaring people.
No, people are like,
Virginia.
oh, I teach my class like that. Darn. I'll get coffee.
So lesson plans may look different for everybody else. We want to know how you do it, right? How you plan for instruction. Do we need to stay here? We're good. Let's start talking about assessments. So I don't know if summative
Don't
first
hold your
before
head.
course? I love it. Let's talk about assessments. I don't know why I wanted to do the summative
Because it's
first.
the easier ones people wrap their heads around.
Let's do formative first. Let's go off of the plan. Let's fly off of our plan for a second, because that never happens, right? In the classroom. We always stick to our plan. How many people here feel confident they could define formative and summative assessment?
That was...
Me either.
That was a formative assessment. That was a formative assessment. We
I
had some
just took
learning
a
to do.
poll.
She took a poll. I do that all the time. Took a poll.
That is an example of formative assessment, and I will ask for your specific definitions. But I'm going to address the elephant in the room first, and we'll go from there, because so many CE providers say, I don't test my students, I don't do assessments. I've heard this from several people. We don't give tests. Is assessing whether learning is occurring, does that always exist in a test format or a quiz format? No. Of course not.
Deanna is assessing all of us right now.
And there's some good
And she
answers
didn't even
happening
know
over
it.
here.
You're assessing all the time. Why are you even in front of the classroom if you aren't paying attention and curious and wanting the people in front of you to be getting something? How do you know you're imparting anything to anyone if you aren't assessing? So we need to know how you specifically assess in your classroom, right? And it may be a quiz. It may be having them journal. It may be you actually watching them do something or having them demonstrate something on you. You're assessing whether learning is occurring in some way. And even as a CE provider, you're assessing whether what you're doing is working in some way. You may have to figure out how to describe that, though, because maybe you don't have it written down. If you have a quiz you can submit that says, here, I do this pre-quiz every time I start this particular subject, that might be something that you could submit. But more likely, there are some other more subtle assessments. And what formative assessment means then is how you're determining as you go along, as the learning process is forming in their brains, right? I have to use words that way. Like formative is how is this happening during the time, right?
May I add to that?
Yeah,
As
please.
an untrained teacher.
Right.
Part of the purpose of formative assessments, which is just taking a temperature about how things are going in as you go along, is to allow us to change gears, to adapt to the way that we read the room. I notice, this is not true, this is fictional. As I read the room, it looks to me like we need a break, okay? That's not, actually, I don't think that that's true, but this is an example of a formative assessment.
Right. Yeah. No, reading your audience, paying attention to what's going on in the room. That's part of being a good teacher. So the whole reason we need evidence of this is because we want to see if you do it and how you do it, right? Virginia?
But beyond that, so in the academic setting, some of you are probably familiar with this low stakes versus high stakes. You've probably heard that. So low stakes assessments are assessments that are not graded. So if, for example, you do the 1-minute paper at the end of class, or if you have students keep journals, if the students keep journals, do you have them then reflect on their own journals and submit their reflections on their growth, or do you read their journals? Which one's really a journal? Right? And so having the students, that share and compare that everybody uses in a classroom, pair up, discuss how your little thing is here, that's engaging students, but it's a chance for you to get feedback from them rather than, oh my gosh, looking around, 50% of the students are awake, I think I'm doing pretty much okay. So if you have a list of reflections that you use and you say, and as part of, again, here are my formative assessments, here's examples of 5 reflection questions I ask for my students. And in my 5 questions, some of these are, we invite the students to share aloud. We invite the students to stand up and share a personal experience. All of that's formative, all of that's informal. So it's not midterm final, and it's not CE providers, oh dear God, I gave a written test and half of the students failed and they paid for the class, right? So there are ways to assess how learning happened. It's a matter of looking at formative. This is in between. I'm going to jump ahead to summative is, did we accomplish what we needed to do? So that's the kind of going back and forth. Assessment is different from evaluation. Evaluation is, were they happy? Which is what we all do at the end of courses, right? But this is, the formative is informal.
May I ask a responsive question to that? So a question that I like to ask on my evaluation sheets, and maybe now I will pull it out and make it a separate piece of paper, is what are 2 take-home ideas? To me, that is always the most interesting part of reading my evaluation forms. I want to know what people were surprised by. And that gives me information about what I'm teaching effectively.
Right, and that's exactly it. And so for students, in saying, what's one new thing you learned today, we hope there's 10 new things they always learn in a class, but maybe you ask the students at the end of class, what's one thing you knew already today that we enhanced your learning today? and write about this for 1 minute and have the students just write a 1-minute paper, their pens to paper, and they're done, and they hand it in at the end of class. That's an example of a formative assessment. Real simple. There's lots of them in education, but these are just good examples. And in looking at this and how you're incorporating this in your teaching, when I said we'll get down into kind of the I don't know what word I used before, but some of this is stuff that you're putting together your portfolio, and this might be an area to say, ooh, how am I doing this other than informal polls? So this might be an opportunity to think about how to shape what you're doing.
Does anybody have any ideas or examples of how you didn't think it was an assessment, but now it's kind of coming clear that maybe you are doing these things?
You just reminded me that last year, fall semester, I implemented 3 things Thursday, so that at the end of class, they were given a sheet to fill out, and it was a reflection on that day. What did they come in that was like old information they kind of knew something about it, what was brand new, and what will this do to shape their future? Those sorts of questions. So I'm already doing it.
Yep, see? That's
And then
the whole point of
if
this
you
class.
use that to shape how you continue, then that benefits everybody.
Yeah. That's what I like about having these discussions, because you're already likely doing so much of this stuff you just didn't know you were doing, or maybe didn't know what to call it.
Case-based learning is a real good example too. If you put up a case and the students discuss a case, that's formative assessment.
You just
if
made
they're
me
engaged.
realize most of the games I play are some kind of assessment because they have readings to do between class. I'm like, let's play a game and see how you do with it, and it's all based on what they were supposed to read between class.
That's true, that's good.
We've given you context. Yay.
That's really good. In the back?
My side of the room is not speaking up, so I'm not getting my steps in.
I was just going to speak to case-based assessments. I'll put a student up in front of the class, obviously a volunteer. But and I'll say what do you see structurally in this person? And we'll go around the room and everybody will take, the opportunity to do this. And after class is over, or after we've discussed assessment, after we've gone through and done the teaching, and I think I've relatively met my objectives, then I'll put this person back up there and we'll do it again. And they will be able to actually apply, because they will have probably not gotten a great deal of what I would like them to see. And so we'll look at it with new eyes afterwards. So that's kind of how I use that case-based pre and post.
I am so excited. I just want to say, if anybody in here is on the conference planning committee, wouldn't it be fun at our next conference to have a whole session on formative assessments and examples of formative assessments?
That would be cool.
Anybody else want to share
Anybody from this
kind of
side?
an aha that I do these kinds of things already? And
Where I am.
Yeah, this was the most challenging part for me in terms of it really made me look at the whole process of how I do it. And one of the things that I do is a lot of call and response. And then I scan the room and see who's got that quizzical look on their face, like, what the heck are you talking about? Or, yeah, I get this. Or they're the ones who are very quiet, because it's like, well, they might be an introvert, but are their eyes lit up to say, yeah, I get this, but I'm just not going to say anything. And so it gives me an opportunity to really see if the material's going in or not. And that's just simple call and response.
okay.
So in ethics class, because my art of ethics class is the black, white, and gray area. So like for communication, they each get a card, one's black, one's white, and one's gray. So it's yes, no, or it depends. So it says on that. So when I'm asking a question, like do we work when we're sick, then everyone just puts up the card. And so people don't feel like they have to raise their hand or anything that. So you can look around the room and see. So is that an assessment?
Yes, it is an assessment.
Absolutely.
It's not so again, it's not a graded assessment, and that what you want to think about is assessing whether learning happened. And so to the case-based and that environment, when you're involving the majority in the class, in the activity, it's involving people in the activity. So now as educators, did any of your minds go to hearing those two examples, how could I make it better and engage more of my students? Right, so it's like, okay, how do I engage more of the students? Get them to discuss on a micro level and then present back to the class. So this is a layer of it, but it's a perfect example. You're assessing whether you got through, and if all the cards that are up are wrong, then you basically need to go back and change something. So
I guess that's what my question on assessment is.
When I first asked the question,
I'm wearing heels.
I may not have taught or said anything yet. So I asked the question, they put up the card, so what then generally happens, so I wouldn't see that as an assessment, I see that as their answer. And then I guess where I see the assessment is a lot of people will say, no, you never work when you're sick. Well, then I would bring up and then teach at that point that what is sickness, what is illness. You know, if you inform your client that you have a cold and you give that client the option, then it would depend. And then of course everyone sneaks up their depends card and they've changed their answer. Wouldn't that be the assessment?
It's all assessment. What you're talking about is active learning and teaching.
Okay.
It's all active learning and teaching as opposed to just telling them. So it's all active learning. But it's a really nice example, and you know, we don't share what goes in these applications, but isn't that lovely that you heard that with the sneaky cards? So, you know, it's like everyone's going to take that away and start using that in teaching. Thank you.
I was watching a clip from Ellen last night on the never have I ever paddles. You know, it's just like that.
Exactly. So let's discuss a little bit about summative assessment then as it relates to formative assessment. So in a classroom setting, usually we've got some kind of exam at the end.
Exam or project.
Or project or something that helps, that your students would have the opportunity to demonstrate to you that throughout that whole learning process, what kind of the sum of all of the things that you've taught them, that's how I have to remember summative is kind of like the sum of the whole thing, right? How do you tell whether, you know, what they got out of it? Whether they got anything out of it and what they got out of it. And a lot of times we talk about final exams and stuff in this category, but what else could be in this category besides a final exam or a practical or something that...
Business plans. I teach business, so it's a customized business plan. That is how I know if they got it all or not.
Okay.
This is the part where you grade them. So that's the other thing is that if you're a classroom provider, this is the part where you issue a grade for, it could be end of unit. I would say the lesson plan makes me scratch my head, but end of unit exam,
yeah.
Midterm exam, final exam, or midterm project, final project. So if you're writing a research paper, here's the guidelines for how you want to write the research paper. That would be a summative assessment.
I teach two classes on critical thinking, and they have to do oral presentations at the end to show that they critically thought and figured out the problems.
Right.
So the guidelines for that assignment is what you would need to submit, right? You don't submit their presentation. You submit, here are the guidelines for the assignment. Here's what I'm asking the students to do.
Right.
Session planning is another summative assessment.
Session planning, yeah.
In the practical techniques class, we have check-ins and finals, and they have the criteria of how we're going to assess their effleurage or their petrissage or their sinking or their body dynamics for alignment, and they have that criteria before the course begins, and they know when they're going to get checked.
Right, maybe they receive the rubric ahead of time so they can begin preparing, right? That would be an example, sure. What else?
I want to bring this up for the CE providers, though, because we talked about lots of options for formative assessments just by reading the room. I'm less confident about summative assessments outside of what are two takeaway ideas that you'll take home today or something like that. But do you have other suggestions or ideas?
An internal certification process.
So your particular...
Mm-hmm. So with our organization, we have them fill out a time test. They have to submit 2 videos and submit client evaluations.
So,
but is that something you use in your own teaching? In other words, if you're responsible for that, you as the teacher, not the organization. So we'd be looking at your involvement in that versus at the end of your course that you teach or the end of your module or workshop that you teach, how do you summatively assess that you accomplished your objectives? That make sense?
So are you asking me if they have met certain objectives based on what they submit to us?
But you and your teaching, so not the bigger organization. So this is going to be hard for some of you. Not the bigger organization, but you are, as the teacher, you write your curriculum, or you take the curriculum, you teach your workshop. So at the end of your workshop, before the people walk out the door, is there anything to say, did I accomplish, right at that moment?
Oh, sure.
Is there anything that accomplishes their learning at that point?
Oh, sure. We do like, well, I do a evaluation at the end of each class.
So the evaluation is whether they liked it, but how do you assess whether they learned anything?
That's one of the questions. Well, it's part of the questions is, what did you learn? And then it's based on some of our course objectives.
Right, and so it's exactly, because what you don't want to necessarily do, and this might come back to you and say, you're looking at the bigger organization, but what did you learn? And so other things to think about is, how will you use this learning in practice? So questions like that are separate from evaluations. I know there are some CE providers that talk about doing long-term follow-up with people, and that's fine too. But it's really thinking, how is this, and maybe, how is this going to make a difference in my practice? How will this make a difference to my patients? So it's that kind of thing. Anyone else? Go ahead.
Kind of long, but with the infant massage, for example, I do this with geriatrics too, but in a different way. In the beginning of class, I'll probably demo, say, with dolls, and then the next day with live babies, but they're observing and participating along. Then they get to kind of collectively take over and teach the class with open book and helping each other out if they forget something. And then at the end, they have to do it on their own while I'm observing and see how they do, if they can remember it without looking at their notes. The parents evaluate them. We have a discussion afterward about what they felt good about, what they felt bad about. But then after the class ends, they have to teach families on their own, one-on-one, groups, small group, large groups, and then get parent feedback. And then they also have to do a self-evaluation. How did they feel like when 5 babies started crying at the same time, or you had a parent who's asking a lot of questions, or a know-it-all, and all, like there's a bunch of things like that. And then they turn in, like, how did you feel when you first started compared to when you did it on your own, and then when you actually have taught several families. And so you kind of get tested all the way through. But yeah, I mean,
and that's kind of a combination. So you've got your kind of your formative assessments, but that kind of what did you get out of it thing feels like the summative part.
But I think, I just would say, I think for those of you who teach for bigger organizations, this is about you, not the bigger organization, and there's going to be a little bit of a conflict in there. So for example, with college students, so community college students, how many students graduated, that's the big summative assessment. That's not your responsibility as a teacher. So coming back to where you are in that, and where you conduct the summative assessment. And it's not necessarily you have to do anything different, you just have to be able to plug this in and say, here's what the summative assessment is, here's what my role is in here. As an instructor or teacher or whatever.
I'm trying to see how this all fits in with webinars. I've been in the classroom for decades, but mostly I'm doing webinars now.
Yeah, me too. That's what I have to say.
Right now, our certification isn't well, I would consider that kind of in the online realm, and we're not there yet. So.
Not ready for distance learning yet.
Yeah.
So is there a timeline? So Deanna just was saying she'd been in the classroom. How many years back could you go, or does it have to be within the last 6 months or currently teaching in the classroom?
I don't know.
We have not set any parameter around that.
Don't throw out any
I don't know that we won't, but there isn't, so, jump in now. I'm not
it's
sure.
my kinesiology syllabi from 2007, but it's current.
Right.
But yeah, but good point. And and again, so part of this, remember, when you're submitting your portfolio, you're submitting it for review. It's not a black mark. Oh my gosh, it didn't go through this time. Here's some place you have to beef up. So we haven't talked about where you have to beef something up, but some of that our hope is this conference in years future would be, let's say you have an issue with formative and summative assessments. So we offer a session on assessments. That might be a way to work on understanding that a little bit more, so you can demonstrate that, not that you're doing it in the classroom, but you attended the course and got your little stamp. So that's another thing. Right now we're drawing from your materials, but there's that possibility too. So for some of you, continuing your education will be part of this portfolio.
Can I ask a question with regard to the summative assessments? Is it my understanding that if you give, like I give a short 2 or 3 question essay, or not essay, one question essay, and then I ask them substantial questions that are in a pattern of information that I expect them to be able to, if you'll forgive the phrase, regurgitate to me. But at the same time, I'm also required, I have the most extensive evaluation form given to me by the California Physical Therapy Association, which is highly annoying, but it's taught me to look at each and every one of the objectives that I have and to see if they've actually met them. And so it's kind of like they're evaluating what they got out of it, and then I'm also coming up from the bottom and evaluating. Is that, do I put those together, or which one of those do you want to see?
It sounds like both of them would be helpful, and it sounds like one is summative and the other is formative, right? So if the
Well, the one that's, no, they're actually both summative, because they're assessing what they've learned and how they've learned it. This is at the very end of the course. And so I'm saying one is probably 3/4 of a page long, triple spaced, and the other one is half a page that I put them through. So it's together. Do I just submit both of them and maybe rewrite them as one assessment? Or, I mean,
don't worry about
I have to turn in one. I guess that's my point.
Don't worry about rewriting anything.
I would turn both in and not worry about rewriting
But with
anything.
context. And so again, with context, in your statement, and in saying what's in your portfolio, you might give 2 or 3 lines explaining what that is.
Right.
So it's not just random pieces of paper, but in demonstrating how I meet this competency, I'm submitting evidence of this and this.
Okay.
And but again, trying not to get a sense of you have to change anything, but showing who you are, that's more helpful.
Yeah, well, I'm saying it's, they don't care whether I'm doing a massage therapy class to anyone. They want this sent into them. So I guess the point is there's one I'm submitting to a higher authority, and then there's one I'm actually keeping for my own records for my students.
But do you use both
Yes.
yourself?
I do,
in that
because
process? I would submit
a lot
both.
of the changes that I've made in my course materials and how I actually teach the class and the modalities that I use, the different types of teaching that I use, have come directly out of those nasty long assessments that they asked me to give.
I would definitely submit both.
Okay, useful assessments, I'm sorry.
I just have a question before we have more questions. Can you think of at least 2 or 3 items in your portfolio that can give a representation of a formative or summative assessment? Okay, and so I guess the other question nobody asked, but I will ask for you is, hey, if I turn in my midterm exam, is that going to get leaked out to the students? The answer is no, this is all confidential. Yeah. No one's, it's just looking at that. So if you have those 2 things, formative and summative, or a handful of things, just take a moment and write them down. I don't want you to forget this. It's like the grocery list. If you don't have it, you end up with other things in the cart. So just write it down.
You may end up with other things in the cart anyways, but at least you'll have the important stuff
Or
too.
you will have forgotten the important things like toilet paper and trash bags.
Right. Do you feel good about the assessment thing, even from the CE perspective?
How can you feel good about
And
assessments?
just as a little commercial to slip in here, I am available to have these conversations on the phone with anytime also as you come up with questions as we go through this process. If you're putting together your portfolio, we want to hear from you if you have questions, and we're happy to discuss this. Also, when you're submitting different items for your portfolio, it isn't that doesn't fit it, veto. We're going to look through all of these things and look for evidence. It's not a, this doesn't fit our picture. It's a, have you told us that this may fit the picture?
In other words,
she's jumping up and down again.
I am. CE providers, if you are one of the reviewers for your organization, that when people go through this evidence of having left your classroom and they go on and do a bunch of other things, and at some point someone reviews all their portfolio, does that make sense? Right? So you do this like, okay, so let's say I take the infant massage class. I'm allergic to children, but I take the class and I do all of my teaching and all my other stuff, and then I go to get my certification. And if you're one of those certification panel people out here doing that work, that could be part of your portfolio. You're still contributing to assessment evaluation. You're still contributing to that. So that might be important for some of you who are working with larger organizations.
I hadn't thought of that. And you were going to say?
Completely lost. I have no idea.
Okay, great. Love that stage.
This is perhaps more of a logistics question that I thought of based on a comment earlier. So the application fees, $240?
$249. Unless you're
$249.
an Alliance member, there's some kind of
discount.
So anyway,
reduced
you submit everything and there's an evaluation that comes back that there's an area of weakness. And now you have to take a course in order to satisfy that area of weakness. What's happening with that application fee? What's the duration? Is there an end date? Who's teaching those courses? What if you have your own teacher preparation, mentorship within your facility? You know, I'm just trying to see if this is kind of self-supportive or if it's really community supportive.
That's a great question, and here's where we're at with that right now. In the application process, we'll be determining, based on the evidence you submit, whether you meet these 10 standards. If the reviewers come back and both reviewers agree that they didn't find evidence for standard 4, whatever standard, it doesn't mean, and they might not choose, you just don't meet that standard. They may say, hey, I don't find evidence of that standard. If it's me, I might suspect that you meet that standard. It's just you didn't given me enough evidence to feel confident about checking the meets box on the rubric, right? So what will happen is you'll receive a call from me. At this point, this is my role in thing, and say, we can't find evidence of standard 4, and you need to submit some more evidence. So there's a remediation process, for lack of a better word, that's built in right now, where we will reach out to you and say, we couldn't, in the portfolio submitted, we couldn't find evidence of standard 4. Please submit something else. Then it's back on you to go back to standard 4 and say, oh my goodness, what's standard 4? And how did I miss that? And and then at that point, the evidence could be anything. You could make another video. You could write another statement. You could submit some other things. So it's on you to kind of come up with that evidence and put it back to us. If at that point you either don't submit more evidence or the evidence doesn't match, I mean, we just decided that the evidence doesn't match that with which we asked for. At that point, we may say you need additional training, and we're not ready to apply the certification to your application yet. What hasn't been determined yet, and I think the board would need to speak to this, not me, because I haven't been given this information yet, is what happens? Do you have to pay again? Is there a reapplication fee that's different? I don't know that any of that's been decided, and maybe you can speak to that.
This is the cart horse problem, is that there's a lot of excitement for the certification, so it's marching forward, and some of these issues have yet to be ironed out. Some of what we know now is based on the beta test. Can I ask for the pretty slide again? I hate to ask for the pretty slide again. But
you can always ask for a pretty slide.
I want to give you an example of, my guess is if we get through to to number 8, a lot of numbers 1 through 8 is stuff that you as educators already do. You do this. I would argue that you do this. And so if I taught you a course in teaching, and at the end we did a project, you already do this. The challenge is going to be teasing it out of your materials. Then we get over to professional responsibility, and this is a little bit odd. Because the little bit odd is professional development and ethical conduct. So for professional development, when you start to look specifically at the standards, I mean, we're all ethical, right? But how do you demonstrate that you do that in your teaching, right? So maybe it's that at your institution, you have to take harassment training every year, or you have to take ethics training every year. It's not ethics as a massage therapy, don't sleep with your clients training. It's ethics as an educator. So,
With your students.
I'm sorry. Oh yeah,
don't sleep with your students.
Definitely sleep with higher administration. No, I'm just kidding. But professional development, at what point do you go out and seek education to help you be a better teacher, not a better massage therapist? So for some of you, it might be, and again, I'm not looking at the standards, but you might think out of the box and you might submit an article to IJTMB. I'm going to say this again about something really cool you do in your classroom. Professional development is writing that article about something cool you do in your classroom and how it's going to inform massage education. So that's things that fall under professional development. And then we get into collaboration, and this is even fuzzier and murkier. How do you collaborate with other health professions? So if we're looking at those sorts of things, and your application comes back to you and you're like, everything is here except for standard 10, I don't collaborate. What's a good solution for showing evidence of collaboration? Number one is figuring out where you have collaborated. So maybe you do what we used to do when I worked at Queensborough. We'd take our students to the Long Island Marathon and would do free post-event massage. And I would always try and engage the other medical students there that happen to be podiatry students. But let's talk to these people. Let's have some collaboration. That's professional collaboration in an educational setting. So I dig back into my, 2007, a little old, but those kinds of things I would not have thought to put in my application until somebody kicked it back and said, you're not showing me collaboration here. So again, with all the rest of these things, I think when you start to look at this, like planning for instruction, lesson plan, right? So a lot of the pieces you've already got.
I'd like to speak to another sort of question I heard in Nina's question, which is about what if I have to take another course and where do I find that?
Yep.
So there are a variety of ways to go about that. One of them is, this meeting. And you can always write a letter to the Alliance saying, gosh, at the next educators conference, it would be really great if there were a class on this thing. That only happens every 2 years. But there are a variety of educational opportunities for teachers, not necessarily teachers of massage. And one of the things that I think would be a goal of the teacher certification process is to help teachers in our field reach outside our field for more expertise development. Does that help you?
Thank you, Ruth. That does, and that answers my concern because, obviously we're in a college model, so, we have courses that we can take in our college if there's an area of weakness. And I was trying to clarify, quite frankly, if this was going to be self-supporting and we had to take it from somebody here.
No. No, our intention is not to be the ones who teach all the classes.
Well, the Alliance may offer that, but not restrict you to that. That would be bad.
We know that happens. That's not the intention of the Alliance.
Right,
yeah.
Right. And Sandy could also chime in.
So I'm hearing two things here. One, that you're putting emphasis on collaboration with people outside the massage therapy profession. And two, and this may sound odd, that it's in person. Because right now, a lot of my collaboration with other educators is on Facebook. Is that evidence?
Well, so Facebook is informal social interaction, but again, I think if we get examples out of people's lives, this will help. But for example, there's an organization, it's ASAP, and I don't know what that acronym stands for, but it's the Society of Allied Health Professionals, of which massage therapists haven't traditionally been part of that group, but they have an educators conference every year. And if you went to their conference and you attended some of their sessions, or you attended one of their webinars or took one of their online courses and got some verification that you learned something there that was related to what you needed here, that might be evidence of making up some area where you needed help. So chatting with somebody on Facebook, not as educational as something that would be like that, whether it's in person or attending a webinar.
I would argue that what we're doing right now is collaboration too. It doesn't have to be outside of our group. This is collaboration. This meeting all week is part of that. The whole reason the professional responsibility section is, by the way, this is my understanding, is because it's not enough, all the things we do in the classroom, but to also be thinking about the massage profession as a whole, why you probably all carved out of your lives to be here this week, that we want to participate in the larger picture that's going on. And so those core competencies rose to the top, and others in this room could speak to that maybe better than I could. Nancy.
I don't know if I'm speaking to that or not, but an example, I think, of collaboration would be the fact that we have Colby College sending down athletes for our sports massage class.
That's an example for you in your situation. We'll all have unique ones.
So
like
I'm
that.
just looking at standard number 7, so we haven't gotten to this, but teachers participate in activities that advance the art and science of massage therapy through collaboration with colleagues and other education and healthcare professionals. So the students just coming and getting massages, but then how does that advance the art and science of massage therapy? Do they take the learning back, for example? So again, it's looking at that standard and looking at where you have evidence in your portfolio of that. So it might be the syllabus that you prepare your students for when the athletes come, and how you assess learning might be part of the rest of your portfolio, but might be in here as well.
That's good.
Yeah, just quickly, I thought I heard earlier that the Alliance is looking at recategorizing their resources. So I'm just saying it might be helpful, if you haven't already thought about it, as to organize them to those competencies so they can be identified. Also, a couple of years ago at one of the Alliance meetings, one of the presenters at the end of their handout indicated which competencies they had intended to address in their presentation. And so I'm just wondering if the shareholders, AMTA, ABMP, on here could put the competency, 4.2, 5.3, whatever, so that I know where I can apply it.
So that's more for the conference planners to make that requirement, and maybe for in future conference planning, it's looking at the competencies and trying to create a smattering of presentations that meet different competencies. And right, and so I mean that would be a different way of structuring this conference. But as far as the teacher resource directory, again, it's a work in progress, so don't look at it now. Don't look. But right now, we're going to try to get it presented to you so that it's classroom resources in one segment. The next step for us is to say, here's where faculty development is. So when you're in faculty development, there are links to things that are active that you could go and do and come back and say, here's evidence of. And there's a list of just other resources. You could read a book, that kind of thing. But the original goal was let's map everything to the competencies, and we realized half the stuff in the directory didn't work. So we do need people still to help us to do that.
Dee Dee, are you still? Yeah. Or I guess my question is with collaboration, is it an example of me teaching collaboration and having this so that the students know how to have that like with other professionals, or is it my collaboration with the others? So for example, in my pediatric bodywork program, the pediatrician is there for 4 hours of the course and explains the relationships with working with families. So is that collaboration that
So that, right, and so that would be something that you would present, you would read the little fine print and put that information forward. And so that's something that reviewers will look at. I can't give you that.
It's you demonstrating that you collaborate with other professionals. Okay. And it's a big fat thumbs up.
One thing that may help is from somebody who's gone through this before, it looks a little bit daunting when you first look at the core competencies, and I was part of the group that helped flesh those out years ago. So yeah, it's a tome when you first look at it. Yeah, you can blame me. No, but I found that in gathering my own material about me, every time I was looking at a competency, it started to crystallize into an example. So for some reason, when I learn, somebody can go blah 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 theory, and I'll go. But if somebody says, like this stone right here, I'll go, oh, I get it. So once you have an actual physical or electronic example from your own bio that's fitting into competencies, you will be surprised how quickly you're going to turn right to the right competency when you look at your next thing you want to brag about yourself with and go, oh, that fits into 6. Oh, that fits into 7. Because they're not really as complicated as they sound right now. We're just not going into the details of exactly the wording of them. So I'm trying to give you encouragement that I think that once you start this process, you're going to come away going, I got these competencies.
Yeah. So a good example out of your syllabi is instructional strategies and delivery. Some of you mentioned you have methods of instruction in the syllabus. So in the methods of instruction, how are you instructing the students? And if that's in your syllabus, then you can highlight that and say, in the syllabus, this is something that we do. We do practical, we do a combination of online, we do hybrid learning, whatever it is. It's in your syllabus. You can draw it out of there. So you don't have to make the stuff up. It's just somewhere in your portfolio. So if you think about it, we talked about having your, what did we talk about? Your syllabus, your learning objectives, your formative and summative assessments, so examples of each of those. So you've got 4 pieces of paper in your portfolio right now, right? Did everybody have a CV? I talked about CVs the other day. If you don't, did I say that? I said this to somebody. If you don't have a CV and you don't know how to write a CV, then you're going to find the nearest college or university to you. You're going to go into their human resources department and you're going to look at the format required for CV, right? And when you look at the format required for CV, you're just going to take that and you're going to plug in all your information. And you'll see that every committee you served on, every time you presented any place, that goes into the CV. That shows who you are. Curriculum vitae, it's who you are as a teacher. But just find someone close to you because they might want to see it. Don't worry about the font and the layout. They get into the weeds. But they look at that. They look at committees that you served on. For us, it probably might be interesting, even conferences that you attended, that's evidence of collaboration because you're here. If you didn't present, that's okay. Would like presenters, but that goes into your CV. That fluffs out a lot of this information.
Good. Let's talk about graded evidence, student evidence. So for each of, so when you're submitting lesson plans, you're submitting some formative and summative assessment examples. Part of the thing we're teasing out here is, show us how you assess them, and then kind of prove that you did by turning in something that you either graded or collected and evaluated in some way, whether you gave them a grade or not. So that's why I put graded in parentheses, because you're probably, and in particular I did that for CE providers who may be assessing students in a way and not assigning a grade. So for many of us in the classroom, we may have grading sheets or something like that where we actually graded the folks. There may be other examples, and those are things that we need to talk about, is how do you submit evidence that the students actually participated in those assessments. Okay, so the graded part was something that was required when we were deciding during the beta testing whether we were going to have classroom teachers submit applications wholly separate of CE providers. And what we found out was that there were more commonalities than not in these application processes, and so we'll put them together. But one of the challenges might be for CE providers is, what is a graded assessment, and how do I submit evidence of that? If you are submitting actual documents with student information on there, of course, omit that. We want to preserve privacy laws and things like that. But can anybody think of examples of what you're going to turn in as far as graded assessments? More of a question, good.
Yeah, so in my taping course, after we've gone through everything, then I take a video of each student, or each therapist, they tape each other. So I take a video of that and then we watch it back all together to look at, and we kind of assess each of them. Everybody talks about what they should have done or what they could have done or what the reaction was. And then you help them with what they would do differently next time. Is that a graded? Is that an assessment?
I never thought of that, but
see, so this, yeah, that
the tricky part is, how do you omit the student from the
well, that
video?
also that sounds like a summative assessment, and so I'm a little fuzzy about the graded student assessment component here.
Yeah.
And maybe something else to think about is, if you're a CE provider, what evidence would you give a student who came to your class and you don't feel like they earned the CEs, or you don't feel like they passed? Is there some way that you document that? So, and this
No,
is
not
it's
through
very hard.
not through NCB.
So not through.
No, it's a certificate of completion, whether they completed it or not.
Right.
Then they don't get their certificate. There's your assessment.
Right, so
They either
yeah,
got
so
it
if
or
it's
they
not in
didn't.
this profession, then that will be a challenge. And I do think I'm all about validating exams, and we talked about educational research before. And so as CE providers, again, putting your portfolio together, putting it to the best of your ability, and if all of a sudden all of these come through and it's everybody in some group is encountering the same challenge, then that's incumbent upon us to really look at the challenge and try to figure, so I don't know the answer to that question. I don't issue grades. In what I'm doing now, so that's me.
One of the requirements of the portfolio process that came from the beta testing was to submit evidence of that the students were actually participated in this assessment. Well, and what would be the reason for that is I could make up anything and put together a portfolio and submit it. I kind of have to prove I have students and that somebody's doing something, right? So it makes sense why this is a requirement. But it might not make so much sense as how do we demonstrate that to me and the other reviewers, right?
I'm going to jump ahead for something. This was another thing we talked about, was having a video evidence of you teaching. And the big conference where I teach every year does not allow videotaping at all. So there was a discussion, well, why don't we just have a video of you teaching something else? And I'm like, teaching my dog how to sit. Or teaching, all right, now we're going to talk about chronic fatigue syndrome, and so it's really interesting because it shows who I am, and it shows, so some of these questions are questions that are going to flesh out as we march forward. Remember, we're actually not fully building the plane as it's flying. We're building the plane as it's about to take off here. So it really is going to take many of you to put together your portfolio. It's going to be it really will be a nice self-reflection when it's done. And when it comes forward, then these are things that I think we are going to still be looking at. Not that we're going to change the bar, change the rules, but it will show us where we have challenges and problems. But I also will say that if you have, if you do assessments in your CE teaching and you have students do the self-assessments and the written kinds of things, would that suffice to fit this requirement? So if you're saying, will you use this in your teaching, how will this change your practice? And if students submit that, then it's not your handwriting. That might be good. I don't know.
Pete is
I
not
was
in
going to
here.
ask Pete who is one of the reviewers. I was going to ask him to. So my answer would be yes. If I'm reviewing this and you've provided copies of their reflection on their journal or something, to me that seems like evidence, whether there's a grade on it or not. So that's why the graded thing throws me off and throws people off, but it's in the terminology, in the instruction, so I had to leave it there. But part of submitting that evidence fits my criteria, and I was going to ask some of the other Pete, are you trying to hide?
He put on a hat and he put on a jacket.
Can I call on you for a second as a fellow reviewer and who went through this beta testing process? Evidence,
that's why I'm in the room.
Evidence that students took, so the graded student evidence, and I'm doing graded like this on purpose because it could be some evidence that the students did something without a grade on it at all, but you're providing that. Ask that same question of him, whether if the students are turning this or that into you,
right,
is that enough evidence?
Right. So as a CE provider, one of the places I teach, I don't grade anything, but the students submit an evaluation and there's an assessment of how it's going to change their learning. So if I submit a couple copies of that with the student's name whited out, would that suffice for this?
In my experience as a reviewer, that would.
Okay. So does everybody feel better now? Let's breathe. Inhale and exhale. It's going to be much easier for classroom teachers.
And as a CompTIA school reviewer, I would consider that evidence.
Okay, and that helps. Thank you.
Yeah. So good. Regina, you were going to say
I was wondering, would this be okay too? Say you have a rubrics that you give to the student beforehand, and then when you go to grade them, did they meet the benchmarks? So that means that's engagement because they had to read the rubrics, and now you're grading them with the rubrics. You give them beforehand, and then you grade the rubrics, and then so it's engagement because did they follow all the benchmarks?
Right,
Would that be something?
So the rubric itself is kind of evidence of your assessment, and then a graded one because you went through and used the rubric with this particular student. That would be the evidence of the graded assessment.
Exactly.
Yeah. So that actually is both. Yeah.
Okay.
Perfect. Good question.
That's good.
Yes, interpreting. It's all interpreted here.
Right. So student evaluation.
Teacher moment over here.
So in addition to that, you're probably all doing some kind of instructor evaluations at the end of your course or your workshop. If you're an NCB approved provider, you're required to do this, right? Aren't you?
Yes, you are.
I'm not anymore, but I believe we had to do that before. So pull out your last teaching evaluation. You can do this in a couple ways. I think it's maybe challenging for the reviewers, maybe not, if you just make a photocopy of the 24 evaluations and submit it all as one PDF document. You could do that because it's evidence of your evaluations, and the reviewer will go through and see how the comments that the students make on your teaching, right, on your instruction. Some institutions, I don't know if any of them are represented here, don't actually give you the evaluation that the students did. They give you a summary afterwards. So some of the higher education institutions, I believe, do that. And so you would submit the summary as your evidence for evaluations because you didn't get the actual things from the students for confidentiality reasons or whatever.
I have a question, and my question is for some of you who teach in large classes, how many evaluations do you want? I mean, if there are students here, if there are folks here who have 25, 30 students and 90 students in a big CE class.
Who has 90 students?
A couple people do.
I want to talk to you about
Once in a while.
marketing. Well, I know you do.
Yeah, I mean, basically, we don't want to bury you in paper, but if you're teaching courses and you've got 5 students in the class and 5 evaluations, then of course that's what you have. And if you're teaching much larger classes, so I guess my point is that more isn't always better, and probably you don't have to submit everything of every evaluation for last semester, but something that's representative of who you are and how you teach, and not the ones that call you evil, because there are students who always call you evil. You don't have to submit those.
Well, there's that. But also, I would, when I apply for this, I will probably go through my eval forms and try to choose some that demonstrate some of the other competencies.
Right.
Like I received feedback that it would be better if I used to use some art, some images in my slideshows, and I received some feedback that it was not always well accepted. It wasn't pathology, let me just say. Okay, it wasn't diseases, but there were some people who were sensitive to some of the things that I thought was funny, and now I don't use that anymore. And I think that's a nice demonstration of how instructor evaluations have changed the future of the way that I teach now.
Also, learner development, competency number 1.
And we don't, at this time, have a parameter around how few or how many you can submit, so
that might change.
That's part of the process as we start to receive portfolios and review them. That's part of the process. We may figure out that, okay, this is too much, we need to have some more parameters around that.
But when people are really small schools, and if you're teaching a course and it's got 5 people in it, I mean, I remember once I had a department chair who said to me, you only got 5 evaluations for clinic. I'm like, I had 6 students and one of them was sick. But he was just upset that I only had 5. And I'm like, look, it was almost 100%, but he wasn't paying attention. So.
Yeah. On the other hand, if you had 20 students and you only gave us 5.
So that's
so
the
let's
other.
say I went through and I picked out the best ones. This makes me look good. This makes me look good.
But nowhere have we asked you how many students are in the class. So
That's
something
right.
else. And saying
So
that
that's
return
something we
rates are
wouldn't know.
really very low, and you wouldn't know. But again,
wouldn't
things
know.
that speak to you in your teaching.
You're trying to make yourself look good, but you shouldn't look at it that way because you're already good. You're just looking for evidence to prove it.
We're demonstrating that we have met the competencies.
Yep.
You're here, and I'd like to also point that out, is that I hope that some of you are developing some confidence in being here. You've got a lot of these pieces already in place.
Yeah.
And it really is a matter of going back and looking in your put together a binder and start putting the pieces together, and then it's a matter of extracting the right information. You've got a lot of this already. So and you're here. I keep saying that, you're here.
So these are a lot of things you already have, but there are a few things you're going to have to probably generate. Oh, was there another point to that?
I had a
Regina?
question around when we do, and I'm not sure if I missed it, video. Is there a length of time? that
There
you're
is,
looking-
and we will talk. Great segue. We're moving right into it right now. Things you're going to need to prepare. How many people already have video of themselves teaching?
In a live classroom, not a recorded, not a screencast.
Not my YouTube channel.
See, so this is probably something you're going to need to prepare. Let's talk kind of quickly about the statement of interest so that then we can talk about videos, because they are a little bit more tricky. But something you're going to need to prepare, maybe you haven't written it up yet, but in your statement of interest, because you've put together all of these elements of your portfolio, you're going to want to describe to us how those elements show that you meet the competencies. So tell us how you meet them. Be specific. I turned in this lesson plan because it demonstrates 5, 6, and 7, and I did this and that. And in my video, I demonstrated, 3 and 7, and so those kinds of things. Be specific in your statement of interest. Don't assume we're going to find everything, but we will because we're that good. Don't assume we're going to find everything. Go ahead and tell us where to find that. You're going to find that in the syllabus, and you're going to find that in the lesson plan, and you're going to find that everywhere, right? So go ahead.
I was just curious, does all of it have to be submitted electronically? Because what if we like to push paper around and we wouldn't mind putting an envelope and mailing it to you? I realize the videos would have to be electronic, but, does that work at all?
At this time, we're accepting them electronically. What I would recommend in that case, push your papers around, do everything on paper, and then go scan it and send us the pictures, to submit the pictures. We're touchy-feely people. That's what we are, right? So we have paper, but we're going to use the technology that's at hand. It makes it easier for the reviewers because we have an actual online platform that allows them to look at each thing in the same screen, things like that. So
if I can just make a comment, the researcher here will make a comment about your statement of interest. Write it last. All right, first thing you do is gather all your materials, analyze your materials. That will actually help you figure out how you meet each of the core competencies that you need to address. So write it last, because if you try to start with, my philosophy of teaching is this, it's going to derail everything. Write it last, assemble your materials.
I would highly recommend that. It's helpful. If you wrote it first, it'd be a completely different statement after you collected all that stuff and realized, wow, I rock. Look at all this stuff I've put together.
And then you have to
You could write a better statement afterwards. I highly recommend that.
So I've done accreditation several times, 3 self-studies, and so what I found is really helpful is that you do all the competencies in like file folders if you're going to do it in paper, or you can do it in your computer in folders.
Right.
And then you collect your stuff and put it in there, like she said. But, make yourself a file cabinet, whether it's computer or physical, and start stuffing things in there. Then you write the report afterwards, because then you can pull up the material as your exhibits as you go.
I highly recommend you put together this portfolio, whether you apply for this or not. The value, the extreme level of value of putting together this stuff to know what do I do? What do I do? How do I do these things is the really critical part of this. The certification, from my opinion, this is my own personal soapbox, but getting the certification and getting that thing in the mail that says you're a certified teacher is kind of like the icing on the cake. The process that you go through to put this together really is the value. And being here and talking about it is the real value and the value to the Alliance to get to educate people in how to put this together. So definitely write your statement of interest last, kind of at the end after you put those things together. So you're going to...
10 minutes.
Yeah, so you're going to share your approach to teaching, your teaching philosophy, the criteria. So there is some parameters around this. We'd rather not read a 20-page Statement of interest, so we ask that it be in about two pages. You can single space it. Are we going to reject it if it goes on to that third page? We're not going to reject it if it goes on to that third page. I'll tell you that right now because I've developed the system that accepts the files. But we'd like it to be, we'd like to see how concisely you can tell us these things, right? Does that make sense? Questions about that one?
How small is the font that we're allowed to use?
Okay, remember your colleagues are reading this. Please stay within, I don't know what, 12 point, is that the next?
I was a joke.
10 point. We can blow it up, right? Expand, whatever. That's probably true, but yeah, keep in mind, we're trying to read these things. All right, so you're going to put together 2 videos of yourself teaching. Why do we want 2 videos? I don't actually know the answer to that question, so I don't know why I asked it. Should we ask questions we don't know the answer to?
Do not ask that
Never
question.
do that. There's an example of what not to do. So the parameters around this is you've got to appear in the teaching frame. So if I'm doing a video of myself talking to you guys right now, I want the video pointing at me, and I'm giving an example of how I'm explaining something. And then maybe somebody raises their hand and asks a question, and I give an example of how I answer that question. Just as we keep going back to this, but it's really the reason to do this is what am I trying to demonstrate here with this video? So am I trying to demonstrate a competency in a particular, in one of those standards? That's the clip you're going to take out. So maybe you film a whole class and you take a 5-minute snippet here and a 5-minute snippet here. Or maybe you pre-plan to, I want to just take a video of this 10-minute segment. You may have to think through how you want to appear and what course and what part of the course you want to, because you're trying to demonstrate a particular competency. So if you're just, it's the first day of class and you're talking about policies in the classroom or something, that may be evidence of one of the competencies, but it might not be as representative as you'd like to be when you're trying to demonstrate some of these other competencies. So think about what part you want to film.
Deanna,
yeah.
Sorry, can you also talk about student confidentiality and permissions?
Yeah, so that's what I was going to say. You might also want to, if you have the ability, I make videos all the time in the little summary of the core competencies that I did on the website, if you've watched that, with my iPhone sitting on a tripod next to me. You can do this on your phone. It doesn't have to be some kind of professional video or whatever. But if someone else besides you is going to appear in that video, you need to get their permission. If you're in an institution that allows that or doesn't allow that, you're going to have to find out what those things are. We aren't going to be checking that. I can tell you that these videos are not going to be in any kind of public forum. You aren't uploading them to YouTube. It's a private portal that's just for the reviewers to watch. These videos aren't going to be out anywhere else, so you get to have some relief that we're not going to play them at the next Alliance get together just for fun.
The blooper reel.
Although that'd be kind of fun for me, but I won't do that. Okay.
But do make sure, those of you who are in an institution or who are affiliated with a larger CE provider, something or other, make sure that you double check. Because there are many state laws that prohibit any kind of taping, and many institutions, especially academic, it's no taping allowed, period. Or they have videotaping policies, and so just making sure you run it up the flagpole so that it does give, it's ethical in that context, and also making sure that if there are students in the frame, generally speaking, the best thing to do is what that is, which is the students are not seen. They can talk off frame, but if they're not seen, it's the face and the voice that can be a problem.
Right.
But we do want to see that you're interacting with people, so just setting up a camera and having you demonstrate something against a whiteboard is not going to be adequate. There needs to be some kind of interaction.
Correct. We kind of want to feel that you're in the classroom doing this. Any questions around that? As far as technology goes, the video needs to be between 5 and 10 minutes long. So you don't want it to be less than 5 minutes or longer than 10 minutes. And the software we use has a limit that the file size can't be more than 400 megabytes. And that's a challenge if you're recording in that 1080p, whatever that is, but it means high resolution in some way. So it needs to be recorded in such a way that it's a small enough file to upload. And so I actually figured out how to check that on my iPhone, which I'd be happy to show anybody else how to do, to make sure you're recording at an appropriate size so you can have a between 5 and 10 minutes, and it's within that file size. And if you're recording on any other devices, I will help you find the expert that would know how to make sure that happens. Okay, I'm your resource to help you find that. I might not know the answers, but I will help you find those answers as far as technology goes. Does that make sense? Does anybody feel nervous about recording themselves teaching? A little bit? Pete, I love your hat.
So also, Deanna, I'm sure you've talked about that reviewers have a confidentiality agreement that they've
I haven't talked about that. Thank you for bringing that up. The reviewers have signed a confidentiality agreement that they won't be sharing. And this is important for just, they're not going to go around and say, well, I reviewed Regina's file, and, you should have seen her in the video. They've actually signed something that says we aren't doing that. In addition, if you teach some kind of proprietary information, or at a school that may, just know that the reviewers have actually signed that they aren't going to discuss this with you or anybody else, or share this information. Does that cover it enough? Yeah, that's important. Are there any other questions about this particular part of it? And we're getting real close to running out of time, aren't we? Or have we run out of time?
So what I was going to say is originally we wanted you all to sit in groups so that you would get a chance to do a little bit more work, and we had more questions, I think, than we thought.
Yeah.
But I hope as we get to the end of today, because I'm not sure where Deanna wants to end, I guess I would hope that each of you in your little pod here might connect with each other to figure out how you can support each other in terms of submitting your applications. If one of you has a good idea and you're at a particular type of school, it might help the other people. Like these folks right here in this line probably all have access to some faculty office and a CETL that could help you with little bits of this. and people aren't going to have that, but if you can think about how you contact them. So that was what I was going to say, is that the strength in likeness here.
Yeah, exactly. So that was the point of sitting together. We thought we might build some alliances, and we encourage you to do so, to be able to put together if you're putting together similar types of portfolios, it might help each other. The whole point is we're helping each other. This isn't a competition. We aren't looking at one portfolio compared to another, only to yourself. And so...
The stamp people are getting very nervous over here, so raise your stamp if you have a stamp. If you want to get stamped at the end of this, you have to find the stamp people. So I would make that announcement.
That's pretty much, yeah. We're right at the end of time. Thank you guys for listening and participating and caring about this.